For our presentation, we looked at music in quarantine, and we looked at the connection between changes in lifestyle, psychological states, and music behaviors during the COVID-19 pandemic. This took place specifically in the shelter-in-place period, and we'll investigate further. Here are references.
Yeah, so this is a reference. This was a study done in 2021.
So we just quickly want to outline the research's goals here. COVID-19's effect on our musical soundscape and our psychological states. That was the goal of analyzing each of those individually as well as cross-referencing them. The study analyzed over 600 participants from 24 different countries, and the questionnaire asked about participants' basic backgrounds, their COVID-19 situations, who they were living with, if they were forced to live with others. Lots of things that occurred during COVID-19 all were analyzed during this study. Our researchers also used the SEM model or structural equation model, along with several other analytical approaches that we'll look into further.
So like Nick mentioned, it was a pretty extensive study. So this study took place during July of 2020. So right after the shelter-in-place regulations went up around the globe. So there were 620 participants, and you can see all of the demographic information pictured over to the left. Most participants were between the ages of 20 and 39. So young adulthood to middle adulthood was the majority of participants, but we see that the age range goes anywhere from 13 to 19 years old, all the way up to 80 to 89 years old. And then most participants were from the US, with almost 56% of participants being from the United States. And then the second highest percentage of people studied were from India as well. And the researchers did study more males than females, about 62% compared to 37% of females. But other than that, a pretty even distribution across different demographic groups. Again, with that most of the age range being between 20 and 39. They also in this study wanted to compare, because they were looking at musical behaviors, they wanted to compare across groups in terms of musicianship. And so they looked at anywhere from, are you a musician? No, not at all, to, yes, I'm a professional musician, and somewhere in that range. And so we see that that is also pretty evenly distributed, with 29%, about 29 to 30% in the no category, 24% were beginner, almost 28% were advanced, and 19% were professional musicians. And that might also be reflective of general population. There's typically going to be a lower percentage of people who are professional musicians in the general population. So then they surveyed the participants on the perceived strictness of the shelter-in-place guidelines. And so this ended up being fairly important, because the researchers were looking at how shelter-in-place during quarantine at the very beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic was affecting musical behaviors through different parameters. And so not only did the majority of participants, 85%, believe that the shelter-in-place guidelines were strict, so scoring anywhere between moderate to extremely strict, the majority of the participants also strictly followed those guidelines, again, moderately to extremely. And so this was a way for the researchers to be able to say, yes, these guidelines were strict, and yes, our participants were following guidelines, so that they could make that connection between shelter in place, being able to have a causal relationship with their observed variables.
Okay, and before we get into diving into the analytical process that our researchers used, I just wanted to highlight some of the key questions and really look at the results of each of these. But as you can see, the researchers used both a Likert scale questions and a 4-point square questions, as well as free response questions, which we'll look at later. But right now we're just looking at the Likert scale and the positive 4-sided square scales. A lot of the ones that we expect to increase, like listening to music with your friends and listening to music to have fun, those typically decreased, as we'll see on the next slide. We can go. So these are the Likert scale questions. And as we can see, staying at home, this increased dramatically in comparison to everything else, which stayed about the same. We can see that people's attention or emotional with music, no change. Attention to music, no change. Musical activities, no change. These are the highest responses typically for everything consisting of music. If we go on to the 4-point sided analysis, we'll see deeper changes. So here are the neighbors' noise level and distraction from residents. So something in the study that they found is if your neighbors were creating any noise during the shelter-in-place study, we typically found it annoying, whether it was a simple tap on the ground or a full-blown rock and roll symphony upstairs. All surveyed people found it fairly annoying at any noise level from the residents. So to begin the analysis of the key questions, as Anne-Marie stated earlier, the division among the participants of professional, beginning music, and everything in between was pretty divided pretty evenly, and the survey found results significant due to this, and they used factor analysis, structural equation model. They also used ANOVA when they wanted to reference specific groups, and then the Mann-Whitney test to cross-reference all the groups. And then lastly, they used the Duns and Spearman p-tests when needed to examine the correlations. So to go into lifestyle choices and perceived stress level, these are the bigger changes that we saw during the shelter-in-place period. Typically, people were using music before the shelter-in-place period to play with friends and to play with children. And as the pandemic escalated and we were forced into more antisocial settings, we saw that as during the shelter-in-place period, dramatic shifts between using music to play with friends and using it to fall asleep or using it to relax would typically stay the same or increase depending on your time alone. And yeah, that basically highlights the shelter-in-place aspect. This observation agrees with some earlier ones that not all people increase stress during the shelter-in-place period, but to conduct the analysis, participants were asked if they spent the shelter-in-place period with people, how many hours they worked at home. All of these aspects were monitored, but we only saw increases and decreases in using music in social and antisocial settings. Looking at the changes in musical behavior and functionality after the shelter-in-place period. So again, we see a bigger increase in using music to fall asleep, an antisocial aspect, versus using music to play with friends or to have fun, going down. These are typical questions that we would see in any COVID-19 shelter-in-place research, but I mean, it's very basic to see these increases. These were to be expected as we see music being used to play with children is also an increase. Just very basic increases here.
So like Nick said, we see an increase in ways that people have changed their musical behaviors, mainly with using music with greater frequency to fall asleep, play with friends, or play with children. And I think back to, my own experience with at the beginning of the shelter-in-place guidelines and how we used music, maybe more frequently, how we adjusted musical behaviors, and how I noticed with myself, I used music more frequently to fall asleep during that summer period, right around July 2020, when this study was conducted. And then also making this distinction with using musical behaviors and musical functions, the distinction between moderating emotion and influencing mood. So the difference between moderating emotion would be to regulating an emotional state where you're either in maybe a heightened emotional state of anxiety or a lowered emotional state, perhaps more a depressive state. And so moderating your emotion with music would return you back to a sort of baseline, whereas influencing your mood might be something like wanting to make yourself probably in this case of shelter in place, feel more positive emotions, experience a more positive mood, happiness, as opposed to a more negative mood as well. And then we see kind of a continuation of this theme, as Nick said, with wanting to use music to be able to relax. Again, this is perhaps makes sense based on what the researchers and what we might predict, especially having gone through the shelter in place guidelines ourselves, wanting to use music to relax more in a time of uncertainty or high stress. So when they did the structural equation modeling, they at first studied all participants regardless of musical skill level. So thinking back to the researchers studied anywhere from not a musician at all the way to being a professional musician. And basically they were looking at, again, how do stress, lifestyle, and musical behaviors, these latent variables, influence the observed variables. So those observed variables were being studied through the key questions that Nick went through earlier, and the latent variables were stress, lifestyle, and musical behaviors. And just a quick recap on what a latent variable is. So a latent variable is something that is a phenomenon that describes observed behaviors, observed parameters. So in this case, again, those key questions were what were being observed, and the latent variables were those phenomenon that try to describe the trends that you're seeing in those observed variables. And so for all of the participants, finding a connection between whether lifestyle influences stress, stress influences musical behaviors, and how those three latent variables interact, and then also how those latent variables interact with the observed variables, again, that we are seeing through those key questions. And so the arrows indicate the direction of causality. So whether the researchers found a strong enough correlation to infer causality between variables, and then the higher coefficient, obviously, meaning a higher contribution of those variables. So for all participants, the researchers found that stress had the greatest contribution to the key question in accordance with stress level change, which was just the question, is your stress level higher during shelter in place? As we look to lifestyle as another latent variable, we look at the strongest relationship between lifestyle and stay at home, which is just, do you stay at home more than you did before shelter in place? Again, we might anticipate that answer would be yes, of course. And then with musical behaviors, looking at the strongest relationship between music and moderating music with emotions. And so going through this on the last slide, where participants are using music to regulate their emotional state, kind of keep them at a baseline almost where they're not in a too high of emotional state or too low of an emotional state. So then they did this again, but they did this across groups. And so they looked at, from different musician levels, how the structural equation modeling was working and the relationships between these latent variables and the observed parameters. And so again, the yellow stars indicate the highest amount of correlation, which the researchers ended up calling causality. Again, the arrows being the direction of causality. And so they found that stress definitely led to changes in musical behaviors. However, this wasn't present in professional musicians, which we thought was really, really interesting. And so whereas many other people found that stress influenced their musical behaviors, the professional musicians did not. And then additionally, in all other groups besides professional musicians, they were seeing greater engagement with music, whereas with the professional musicians, they weren't necessarily seeing that. And that might make sense, perhaps, if we think about how much each of these groups is engaging with music on a regular basis. For professional music, because that's their career, they're going to be doing that really regularly. And so it might make sense that a change in their environment might not influence the amount that they're engaging with music. And then we're also seeing a variation in the highest contribution of latent variables across groups as well. However, we're still seeing pretty similar general trends here. So if we're looking at the non-musicians, we see that stress has the highest influence on, did your stress level increase? Several of the participants obviously answered yes, if that's the largest correlation. And then beginner musicians saying that they felt more work risk, whereas again, advanced musicians felt more work risk and professional musicians felt higher stress change. And so those being kind of the same two observed variables that we're seeing the highest occurrence of. As we look to lifestyle, we see that non-musicians, beginner musicians, and professional musicians and advanced musicians all answered that the biggest impact is that from their lifestyle is that they were staying at home more frequently. And then in terms of musical behavior, we're seeing a trend again with moderating emotions with music. Now, whether that is, we see moderate emotions with music for beginner musicians and advanced musicians, but we also see this key question that coordinates with the observed variable emotional with music. And so that was, do you feel more emotional when you're listening to music? And so several of the groups indicated that as well. And so we see kind of that, again, that general theme of the tie between music and emotion.
So just to look at the key takeaways, we got to see the differences in how COVID affected everyone's lifestyle choices, their musical choices, and their professional lives. And I mean, we got to see that stress didn't influence the professional musicians, which is pretty interesting to see that they're just playing music on such a consistent basis that they play it without influence of stress, which is just incredible. We got to see the what music was used for throughout COVID, just increasing use for emotional regulation, sleep, playing with children. We got to see that it decreased in playing with friends, slight increase in influencing mood. Just lots of interesting uses for music were studied during this research, as well as the influence that it had on stress for non-musicians, beginners, and intermediate musicians. There's a tremendous amount of influence that stress can have on the music performed, the way it's learned. Just very interesting to see these correlations and something you wouldn't typically see with music and one's lifestyle and their psychological state.
And the last thing that the researchers kind of close with in this study is that they talk about the importance of the internet in musical behaviors. And so thinking back to the beginning of shelter in place back in the spring and summer of 2020, how important the internet was in terms of connectedness with family or friends or strangers even, and how they were able to mediate that connection, especially through music. And so we thought of the example, there was a video that came out at the beginning of the shelter in place where there were numerous celebrities from the United States all singing John Lennon's Imagine together, and how it went totally viral, and how that is an example. And there are several other examples of musical experiences like that going viral and being experienced by the general public or the globe, and how the researchers discuss that as being a major influence in terms of how musical behaviors are shaped and how individuals were able to engage with music throughout the duration of the COVID-19 shelter-in-place order. With that, thank you very much for listening to our presentation.
Thank you.